morning, everyone. So let's make a start with the next session. It's a great pleasure to introduce Claire Monteleoni. Claire's one of the, I had the pleasure of having lunch with Claire the other day, and she's really one of the trailblazers in the whole area of informatics and machine learning for the study of climate change. And it's quite impressive that she started this initiative in 2011. She started a conference around the area of machine learning and climate change in 2011, so 9 years ago when the topic wasn't cool. And I think it's really amazing to have a trailblazer like Claire on the stage today to talk to us about this topic of machine learning for climate change. So just a bit about Claire. Claire's an associate professor of computer science at the University of Colorado Boulder, which she joined in 2018, following positions from the University of Paris, CNRS, George Washington University, and Columbia University. She completed her PhD and master's in computer science at MIT and was a postdoc at University College San Diego. She holds a bachelor's in Earth and Planetary Sciences for Harvard. Her research on machine learning for the study of climate change helps launch this interdisciplinary field of climate informatics. And as I mentioned before, in 2011, she co-founded the International Workshop of Climate Informatics. So I'm really looking forward to this talk, and please join me in welcoming Claire to the stage.
Thanks for the nice introduction, Danielle. Thanks so much for the invitation. I'm really excited to be here in Latin America with all of you. So we study climate change due to the prevalence of extreme events such as megastorms and heat waves causing wildfire and drought, and their effects on communities and ecosystems. And climate informatics is based on the vision that machine learning can shed light on climate change. So climate scientists have a consensus about climate change, and we'll talk about that in a second. But any climate scientist will tell you there's still a lot of remaining uncertainties and open questions. So given those pictures of those extreme events, one of the challenge problems is how is climate change going to affect extreme events? This was posed as a grand challenge problem by the World Climate Research Program, a group of top climate scientists. And we can kind of talk through this as an example of a challenge problem. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change produces these reports that inform the United Nations. The 5th assessment report came out in 2013. And actually, I would encourage everybody, you might not have time to read the report, but the first few pages is called the Summary for Policymakers. And hopefully you'll have time to read that. It has some great figures. And we can look at what is known. And so in the 5th assessment report, data was put forth showing that, on average, we've had warming temperature. So this is a warming trend in the last 100 years or so of average temperature at these locations. And another thing that I really like about the Summary for Policymakers with these figures is that sometimes where there's uncertainty, they really make it very clear what the uncertainty is about and walk you through sort of an intuitive example. So we're going to walk through one of those. Okay, yeah, there's some missing data. I think everyone in South America is wondering about that missing data. Ask the IPCC. Let's walk through a thought experiment put forward by the IPCC. So, okay, so this shows that average temperature in the location, in many, many locations, is increasing. Let's consider just temperature as a random variable. So we're drawing a probability density function. The y-axis is a probability, and the x-axis is the temperature value. So if we take an average temperature and consider a PDF of, say, a Gaussian in the gray curve, and we say, well, on average, there's been warming, we just shift them into a slightly warmer temperature. And under this assumption of Gaussianity, et cetera, then, of course, the new PDF will be in the dotted line. And what happens to the tails? So we'll get more mass, more probability of extreme hot weather. And just under this change to the distribution, we would actually get lower probability of seeing extreme cold weather. So the IPCC has concluded that there's a mean shift to a warmer mean. And so some of the extremes and things that we're seeing could just be due to this effect. But this is really an oversimplification because this is only talking about the mean, not the variance, for example. We could start with the same Gaussian in gray, and even without a mean shift, look at what happens if we increase the variance. So we get the PDF with the larger variance in the dotted line, and of course, now we have heavier tails on both sides. So this means we'll have a higher probability of both extreme hot weather and a higher probability of extreme cold weather. And since not a lot is known about what's going on with the variance, this is one possibility. But the point of this thought experiment is that really there's an infinite number of possibilities, right? A lot of strong assumptions were made here. You know, why do we even have to have symmetry? And it's certainly possible we could be in sort of an asymmetric regime where climate change is going to give us higher probability of extreme hot events, but we're going to see about the same frequency of extreme cold events, for example. So, as I said, they raised this as a challenge problem to try to understand what's going on in the extremes. And we can think of the extremes as tails, especially when we're just considering a single variable. But of course, all the pictures that I showed in the beginning of these hot events and these wet events are going to be functions of more than one random variable. But let's use this as sort of a thought experiment of how we might want to use machine learning here. So okay, say I want to study extremes. Extremes are rare by definition. So we're going to have either, we're going to have extremely high class imbalance. If we're looking at extremes, we're not going to have a lot of positive examples of extremes in historical data. Not enough to, say, train our learning algorithms. We also did a thought experiment that even for a single random variable, temperature, the distribution of temperature may be changed by climate change. And so, of course, this can change, the tails will be sensitive to that. This can change the extremes. So we would be very limited if we could only make use of past data and the statistics that we can compute on past data in trying to predict future climates. And so one of the things that I hope to do, I know that there's a lot of early career people in the audience figuring out, what kind of problems they want to study, is try to convince you why you might want to study climate change in terms of the uniqueness of the data. And one thing that pretty much no other field has is that for over 40 years, we've had scientists and computer programmers making simulated climate models. So these are physics-driven climate simulations that I will talk about later. But essentially, we have millions of variables representing atmosphere, ocean, land, and ice processes. They're all at some sort of spatial resolution over the globe, and they're evolving with time. This takes us into the massive big data setting where we view the simulated data coming from the physical simulations that as something that could also be input to the to the machine learning. So we also have historical data augmented with the simulated data, and of course now we're in the big data regime, and we can talk about machine learning. So I claim this is a really unique application area, mostly because of these massive amounts of climate model data. But let's just go over what the data types are in this space. So to really understand how drastic the changes in climate are in the future, we need to get a sense of climate changes in the past. But unfortunately, in the past, we don't have a big data problem. We have a collection of small data problems that are quite heterogeneous. So, you know, a sea captain may have written down the temperature and meteorological conditions, and then if it rained or the ship sank, you know, that data was lost. We did not have a nice global grid of measurements in the past. We have these proxies. So these are other data types that can be used to infer aspects about temperature and atmospheric gas concentrations. So there are biological proxies. So trees and corals in the ocean can be studied because it's understood how their growth depended on temperature and available nutrients. Similarly, you could look at sediment under a body of water. Different pollen species are known to thrive under different nutrient and temperature conditions, so you can infer that way. And you may have also heard of ice cores, where you go to glaciers and take these columns of ice. The trapped air bubbles will allow you to look at atmospheric concentrations, and then the water isotopes can be used to infer temperature. So sparse in space, even though they go pretty far back in time, they are, you know, not densely located over the globe, these proxies, and heterogeneous. By the way, feel free to stop me with any questions. I hope I'm not speaking too fast, and I also hope I'm not using jargon. Feel free to ask questions. That's the point of this meeting, and I think it's great that all the talks have been kind of slow and approachable. Okay, that's also known as paleo data. We're currently in what's known as the observation era. So for the past few hundred years, we've been getting more and more measurement stations locally. We have a variety of satellite sensors, you know, continuously imaging on a variety of bands. We have balloons going up and down in the atmosphere. We have sensing devices going up and down in the ocean. And so now we're drowning in drastic amounts of data. So now the issue is that, so first, these massive data products don't go back very far in time. They're just in the present observation era. Secondly, now we are maybe in the massive data or high dimensional setting where we might actually need to care about a lower dimensional subspace or manifold that contains meaningful information because we're measuring things at such high resolution. And so what I think is great about the climate model simulations, even though it's simulated fake data, is that in some sense this is our only lens into the distant past and the distant future. And on the positive side, it is fake data, but it encodes physical first principles and domain science knowledge from the relative scientists. Some caveats. These models are not simulated at scale. So we divide up the atmosphere into grid boxes. Typically, this was done about 100 kilometers per side. Cubic boxes, although some teams would use a level set of pressure for the height. And that loses some information. It loses moist processes such as clouds. So understanding clouds is really a key to understanding climate change, but clouds operate at a very small spatial resolution. You really have to reason about whether water will condense on an aerosol particle. So there's spatial discrepancies between the atmosphere and ocean, and also temporal. So the atmosphere circulates on the order of a couple weeks. The ocean circulates on the order of hundreds of years. So this issue of how to couple the atmosphere and the ocean, you're dealing with drastic scale differences numerically in space and time. And so discretizations, parameterizations were done. That's a caveat. And even though you have a lens into the distant future, you can't validate that. So towards plugging you guys all getting involved, and also towards mentioning that there's some critical mass here, I wanted to mention the Climate Informatics community. And this is really as open as possible, bringing in all stripes of AI, statistics, data mining, machine learning, together with all aspects of climate science, atmospheric chemistry, paleoclimate reconstruction, the climate modelers who make these simulations, et cetera. And so, as Danielle mentioned, we have critical mass now. We're actually really excited to announce that we're turning a decade old, and we're changing our name from a workshop to a conference, TBD in Oxford, or it will be in Oxford. The submission deadline is TBD. Usually it's around June. So if you find someone locally, I mean, a lot of people in South America are studying climate in various ways. I was actually really encouraged to see a lot of related work on the posters related to climate and environmental topics, and would love to chat with those folks. Write up a 2 to 4 page short paper or abstract, and we try to do a lot of travel funding for students in early career, and come hang out with us in Oxford. Oh, and we also have a hackathon, so I'll talk about that later. So 5 years ago, in trying to drum up interest for this in the machine learning community, we presented a tutorial at NeurIPS. And we tried to sort of divide up how AI can be used to help the study of climate change. Keep in mind, though, this is really like early days, for example, the early days of bioinformatics, where you couldn't really predict what all the implications would be. We talked about, and actually I have the video of the tutorial and the slides available on my website if you want to hear myself and Arindam Banerjee go on much longer about this. You can look that up. But we sort of broke it down into the problem of reconstructing the past climates, right? That's where we have major sparsity in space and time. We have sort of data fusion issues, small data issues. But there's a lot of uncertainty on past climate, so this is an important problem. Local climate prediction means that you have to downscale the predictions from the resolution of these models that are at 100 kilometer cubed grids, because governments such as the UK government are asking climate scientists for predictions at the level of postal code. Right now, that's pretty hard to do. So my lab has mainly focused on the topics in green. So how do you take these physics-driven predictors? Now you have an ensemble of predictors from all different countries. They might disagree. Can we use AI to sort of combine the predictions and robustify the ensemble prediction? Throughout, if your interest is on spatiotemporal data, this is just sort of a placeholder to say there's a lot of spatiotemporal data. There's a lot of long-range and non-stationary interactions over both space and time. It's a really interesting domain. Also, the data is really easy to access, and there's a lot of it and freely available. We also work on extremes, bringing it full circle to the intro where I talked about some of these open questions in predicting extremes. But again, this is just scratching the surface. So I really want to encourage people, of course, maybe you came in the room because you think climate change is an impactful thing to worry about, and it would be nice to apply your AI skills to that. It's an extremely data-rich playground. The data sets are public. I'm talking both about all these observation fields, so spatiotemporal data fields, and the output of climate models. And there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. Unlike some other application areas, climate scientists are extremely advanced in terms of computation. They're already writing their own code. So then the analytics can just be this really targeted plug-in. You know, in some other domains, you have to start from square one with a domain expert who's an expert on their science, but you know, maybe we'll expect more computer science help from your team than you really want to do as a machine learning person. Physics. Physical laws have to hold. This gives us some inertia. This gives us some predictability. Hopefully more predictable than some of the other things that machine learning is asked to predict. And funding opportunities. Okay, so myth busting. You want to zone out and check your email because you are concerned that this has nothing to do with your kind of machine learning. Every kind of machine learning can help. I will touch on some unsupervised learning topics, in particular topic models, online learning and deep learning. We've also used techniques from sparse matrix completion. And if you look at the proceedings of any climate informatics workshop, you'll see a lot of different techniques. The second myth, maybe also very important in this audience, since we're mostly machine learners, we've had a lot of theoretical and algorithmic talks, is that it's not going to really, like maybe we're doing good for the environment, but we've already chose our career, and our career is to contribute new machine learning research. So what's in it for us? There's no new machine learning research here. That's also, I think, a really important myth to bust for the purpose of motivating us to work on climate change. It is possible to sort of work at the sweet spot. And generally, anyone that works on applications knows that you can get really new open questions for the design of machine learning algorithms out of applications. So some problems that came up in our research were, how do you do detection and tracking of highly deformable patterns? So if you look in the machine vision literature, you know, there are object detection and tracking algorithms. People claim to be able to deal with deformable objects. They mean, you know, a cat or a human walking. In climate, we have these ephemeral patterns in fluids that are not really like a cat. One other thing that I thought was cool, and I'll try to hit today, was a problem where you need to actually predict at multiple time lags into the future simultaneously. And you know, how can you sort of share influence between those tasks? And another thing that I think is sort of an interesting story was that I had been working on, like in my past life, on the algorithmic side, on online learning with expert advice for things like stock market prediction. And I was interested in, how do you learn when you're in an adversarial setting and you can't assume that your data is IID? So you actually want to learn the level of non-stationarity at the same time as doing a good job at your learning task. Showed that worked in climate, and then extended it to non-stationarity over time and other dimensions. So spatiotemporal dimensions, latitude, longitude, but really it could be any other kinds of dimensions. And was able to publish this in AI conferences, helping climate scientists, but recently we did a theoretical regret analysis that's under review at a theory conference. Okay, so that's intro. Any questions? Okay. So because I have them in the intro, I'm going to talk about our work on extremes first. So we had money from the US National Science Foundation to try to learn how climate extremes would be affected under climate change. I had a machine learning student, a theoretical machine learning student, who said, okay, what's the definition of a climate extreme? So she looked at the IPCC's special report on extremes and found multiple different definitions and was not satisfied. So sometimes an extreme is defined as you look at a single variable like temperature, and you look when it goes over a particular threshold. That's an extreme. So of course, this is not going to allow, this is not a soft definition that allows us to have multiple levels of severity. And also, this doesn't seem to speak very well to extreme events because that's for a particular variable, but these events are typically multivariate. Also, if you look in the climate literature, for any particular event that you're looking for, say drought, you can find an index that's used to detect drought. But it would be really nice to have sort of an agnostic technique that could detect any kind of extreme event. So a more flexible technique. And of course, these definitions of extremes are in turn subject to the local, should be subject to the local climate characteristics. So just this question of how do we define extremes is a little bit ill-defined. But I raise this to show that really any area of machine learning can play a role. And so one thing that we're really interested in my lab on is unsupervised learning. And so there was a role for unsupervised learning here. So the idea is machine learning could be used in an unsupervised way to provide data-driven definitions of extreme events. So I'm going to present a slightly older paper on this using a slightly older method to hopefully spur your interest to then apply the newest unsupervised learning technique to this problem. But this one's pretty easy to explain and pretty interpretable. So we actually just used the idea of topic modeling from natural language processing. And so just a punchline about what we get out of this is we can find multivariate extreme events. We can detect multiple types of events. And the resulting definitions of these events is probabilistic, so it's sort of soft. We have the continuum, not sharp thresholds. And in terms of training, so as opposed to some extreme value methods, we don't have to actually care about things that are extremal. We can train with all the data. Okay. So we've been hearing a lot about deep learning, and even though this is a very basic method in probabilistic graphical modeling, I'll mention topic modeling briefly. So topic modeling is a form of unsupervised Bayesian model. In particular, I'm talking about LDA, latent Dirichlet allocation. And in text, the idea is that a document could be a mixture over topics. So a document might talk about soccer or football in the beginning, but then it might talk about politics because it was using football as a metaphor. So we might expect to have multiple topics in a document. And a topic mathematically can just be interpreted as a probability distribution induced over a language. So different topics induce different probability distributions. So the word field, campo, could be used a lot in the sports topic, but it could also be used a lot in the agriculture topic. Okay? And so the goal was with LDA, when designed in the NLP setting, was that, well, we'll use these words in the document as observations, and we'll assume that the observations, the words, are conditionally independent given the topic. They're not independent, right? Because it really depends on what the underlying topic is. And so then we would learn the topics that are prevalent in a document, where a topic, again, is just going to assign each topic will assign different probabilities to all the words. So just to be very clear, we're not using text data. We don't do NLP in my lab. We are using climatological data. I mean, topic modeling has also been used in image data and computer vision. So instead of words as our observations, we have climatological variables that we've discretized with respect to local climate characteristics, basically using z-score, considering the mean and the variance in a local region of, say, pressure or relative humidity, et cetera. So for each variable, we discretize it based on its normal behavior in the region. You could think of putting it into buckets, high, medium, and low. We actually used 5 buckets, with 5 being, anomalously high for that region, 1 being anomalously low for that region, and 3 being about average. So those are going to be our observations. And running topic modeling, you'll get topics. So you'll get distributions over the observations. Even when we used a pretty small number of topics, some of the topics are not very informative because they're just modeling average behavior. Everything is kind of normal weather, it's in its 3 or medium state. But even when using a pretty small number of topics, we did find some topics that corresponded to extremes. So we found topics that put a lot of probability mass on extremely low humidity, low precipitable water, very high pressure, high temperature, corresponding to kind of a drought or heat wave type event. And then analogously for very wet events. So this is, fulfills our promises that we were looking for in that we can detect different kinds of events. They're multivariate, that you have these soft probabilistic models as opposed to hard thresholds. One thing when you do a creative project in a different field is that if you're solving a problem that had not been thought of or addressed, you're not going to have a technique. I talked in the panel about providing a baseline. You're not going to have a baseline to compare to. So we could not do quantitative experiments, but we were able to do qualitative experiments where the human in the loop would look and say, oh, that topic looks like drought. So now I'm just going to plot the prevalence of that topic over space and see if we can recover known historical droughts. So for example, there was in the Sahel region below the Sahara, there was a very important historical drought in the 1970s. And this is just plotting a drought topic. You'll see other regions seem to flare up, but keep in mind that the observations are relative to local conditions. That's how they were discretized. So this is saying, okay, it may have been slightly hotter with respect to the local conditions in that region in some of those other places. Okay. All right. Changing gears. We have also been looking at extremes in terms of forecasting. So trying to forecast the track of a hurricane or extreme storm. And then we did a hackathon on forecasting the intensity, like will it get up to a category 4, category 5 storm. So this was work that I did on sabbatical at Paris-Saclay with a master's student and an M2 intern, Guillaume Charpiat at INRIA, Balazs Kegel, who's somewhere now, I don't know, Huawei, and Sophie Gifford-Rosen was the lead author who did part of her postdoc with me in France and then the rest of her postdoc in Boulder. So we wanted to do a proof of concept as to whether we could use deep learning to forecast the track of extreme storms. There's a nice database that NOAA provides that gives us storm tracks. So we can get the latitude and longitude coordinates of storms at every 6 hours. So we'll get that tuple. We'll have a few other pieces of data, such as wind intensity, which will directly map to what category it currently is, and a couple other pieces of metadata that I'll mention later. And this is a great database dating back of 3,000 storms since 1979 in all basins. And we decided to use all the basins. So we don't care if you call it a cyclone, a hurricane, typhoon. We'll use all the basins. So we did sort of a proof of concept predicting 6 hours in advance. I'm going to talk more about the 24-hour project because I think communities would be more interested in that than having a 6-hour warning. So, the time series is measured every 6 hours, and so at a particular time, you want to predict ahead to 24 hours. And so just to be very clear, if I'm here, I can have knowledge of what happened in the past when I'm trying to predict a day ahead, but of course I can't see into the future. I don't have that. These sorts of things are starting to crop up. There's a lot of deep minders here. There's a project on precipitation nowcasting going on there. One of the first ones we're aware of at a NeurIPS workshop, for example, was some other folks. What they did was they would just look basin by basin. So it's a very different approach because the basin itself is that's going to be a lot of latitude, longitude pixels. It's also going to be fewer total storms, the ones that were in that basin. And you also get into a challenge that what happens if the storm leaves my basin that I'm looking at? Anyway, it was a different approach, and they used recurrence, which we did not. What we did was we registered our spatiotemporal fields, so wind and pressure, around the storm center because we had the tracks database, so we could use that to tell us how to register our data. And then we did use regions around the storm center so that we could get images, but this was much smaller latitude, longitude patches than used in that other work. The only data we looked at, in addition to the tracks, was wind fields and pressure fields. And we took the wind fields at several geopotential heights. So several geopotential heights and 2 steps in the past. Sorry, for the fields, we used only the current time and 1 time step in the past. But for the tracks, we also looked at 2 steps in the past. And these are sort of our 0-dimensional features, the kind of metadata that we had. In addition to our XY pair of latitude, longitude, we had wind speed, which is basically just what is used to threshold whether it's a category 3 or et cetera storm. The actual day of the year can be helpful, and the current distance to land. So what we found worked best was to pre-train on each data type in a supervised manner and then do a fine-tuning altogether. So we did CNNs for our wind and pressure data, and they're trying to predict, they're being trained in a supervised setting, they're just trying to predict my X and Y displacement in 24 hours. These were ReLU with batch normalization CNNs, and we trained them separately. Wind and pressure behave differently, and it did not make sense to fuse them at the lower layers. And then if you consider our 0-dimensional data, we don't have images at all. So for that, we, in a supervised fashion, trained just a fully connected MLP. And then we took some of the final fully connected layers, just merged them to do our final fine-tuning, where we again have the supervised task to predict latitude and longitude. The weights have already been pre-trained, but we do allow all weights to update if needed. Mostly this will learn your final layer weights, of course. Those are the ones that are going to change. And so we found lifts as we included each data type and a final lift by doing pre-training as opposed to just training the whole thing from scratch. So, comparisons. The National Hurricane Center in the US is what we compared to. And they have a statistical model where the state-of-the-art statistical model is published so we can test it on all past years. They also have a consensus of dynamical models that they use. So by dynamical models, I mean physics-driven models. They don't publish that. They just publish its predictions. So at 2018, we can get the prediction of the 2018 dynamical model. But we can't get the prediction of the 2018 dynamical model on the 2017 year because they were predicting with the 2017 model that year. So we couldn't do an apples-to-apples comparison with their dynamical model. But with respect to the statistical model, we saw performance gains in terms of the number of kilometers that you're off by in these displacements. And of course, we can hone down these improvements as we consider testing only on hurricanes or testing at 6-hour leads. So we can do a non-apples-to-apples comparison with the dynamical model and see that the neural network in blue outperforms the dynamical model in red till about 2010. So this is for the most part comparable, but we can only compare to the statistical model in a fair way. People like to look at how a deep learning architecture thinks differently than other techniques. So here's a track, and then we have the error for each of the three techniques, the dynamical consensus, the statistical used by the National Hurricane Center, and the neural network. And sometimes it does interesting things. First off, you'll see that the errors are all about the same order of magnitude, so this is a comparable technique to state-of-the-art. But with something like this, where the storm turns suddenly, somehow the neural network was predicting that. Yeah?
Can I ask you a question? You're trying to predict the location of the eye of the storm, of the center? Okay. Do you predict other variables?
We'll talk about a hackathon to predict intensity, which is the categorization.
Right, because I was wondering if there's a way of making more predictions, and by making more predictions, you'll have more information flowing into the neural network weights.
Ooh, I like that.
So you'll be able to predict better.
Let's chat offline. I like that. Okay, do we predict other variables? We did a hackathon on predicting intensity. So intensity is, people are saying when it lands on Haiti, is it going to be category 3 or category 2? And the money and resources that I am allowed to send by law might depend on these things, which are just thresholding a wind intensity. So can we predict that? So for this, we did a hackathon. I just want to quickly mention, I think it's awesome you've been having hackathons every afternoon. We find this is a really great way to build collaborations, especially interdisciplinary. So we've had hackathons on predicting the El Nino Southern Oscillation at like a 3-month lag, at predicting sea ice extent at a seasonal lag, California temperature extremes. 2018 was predicting the storm intensity. And then we've also done, this year I guess it was more of a regression task, which is trying to predict PCTO. Basically, it was kind of an in-painting task, trying to in-paint the ocean with its PCO2 levels, which are extremely important from climate change, from other variables. Ramp.studio in Paris has 4 of our past hackathons online. Last year we used CodaLab, another hackathon open source suite from Paris. These are great. So we gave people actually a superset of the data. We gave them even more different kinds of fields. You sort of implement on your own your feature extractor and your regressor. If you're doing an end-to-end thing like deep learning, you can put everything into your regressor and just leave the feature extractor method empty. And then, of course, we have a data set that is held behind a firewall. We would do this as the kickoff to our workshop. So some people were clearly not paying attention to talks. They were still submitting. The error rate went down in terms of the wind speed error. And that was fun. OK, so I have 15 minutes left. The remaining topic I will talk about, but I might talk about it in kind of a summary sort of fashion. Any questions so far? OK. So I think it's just worth talking about. Basically, I'm going to together mention spatiotemporal data and how to improve the ensemble prediction of climate models. What's a climate model? So at a high level, there's 4 systems being modeled: atmosphere, ocean, land, and cryosphere, so processes involving ice. And I already mentioned there's issues of how do you even couple the atmosphere and ocean. So there's interactions between those systems. Those are the 4 major systems that have components inside of them, each of which is just going to be modeled by a differential equation. So you're going to have heat transfer, evaporation, different atmospheric gases transitioning into other atmospheric gases, et cetera. The parameters of these PDEs are considered to be as well known as gravity. But then there's a lot of art in how they're coupled and how they're discretized. So we do have things based on first principles, but different teams have managed this discretization challenge differently. There's supposed to be a lot of text on this slide because there are a lot of climate models from a lot of different countries. The first one was in Princeton in 1969. So each of these is an entire laboratory of people, dealing with the first principle science and then dealing with simulating these differential equations in software, typically Fortran. And there's some shared code also between these models. They're not independent, so a lot of the teams use the same model for sea ice. But these can be very useful for making climate predictions. And these models informed the IPCC when it won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. So how can they be useful? Probably one of the most famous plots for this is that in black, we have the observed measure of temperature. So temperature anomaly has subtracted out average temperature in the past. That's why it's zero-centered. But black is what had been observed. And then you can run 2 simulation challenges. One is all the models from all the different countries run as usual, and then you get the ensemble spread in blue and the multi-model mean in dark blue, and it does not match the observations very well. It is a cooler climate. The other is all the models have to have anthropogenic gases pumped into them in simulation, and then they run, and you get the spread in orange and that multi-model mean in red, and then you can match observations. So that was used to do sort of a causal attribution of the climate change to the human-induced greenhouse gases. So that's the kind of things that you can use them for. And then if you're the US Department of Energy and you're trying to figure out different future energy policies, you can consider different scenarios, different interventions that I could do, and then run the models under those different initial conditions. In addition to initial conditions, you can also tweak things as you're going along, and that's called a forcing. You could explode a volcano and inject aerosols or different gases. You could turn off carbon emissions and change the atmospheric concentrations. Those are called forcings. So lots of data is output by the models with these various forcings. And let's consider like one scenario. And really the only point of this curve is to show that the very thin squiggly lines, I don't know if these can be seen, but you have some very thin colored squiggly lines, are the models from all the different countries. We have 30 or 40 models in the ensemble. And this is for global mean temperature anomaly, so it's temperature where averages in the locations have been subtracted out to kind of group this a little bit more around 0 and make it lower variance when we average over locations. Global mean temperature computed that way. And we do get a pretty good match of observations. The observations are in blue and the multi-model mean is in red. I gave this talk I gave the talk about this first data set at a snowbird a long time ago that Jan had invited me to, and he stood up in the back and said, "Why is there so much like bunching in the past?" And there's no tuning in a machine learning sense, and there's no parameter fitting in a machine learning sense. However, if a team of climate scientists shows up at a competition and they can't even match past observations, they might change something. And the models are super sensitive. If you inject a little bit more aerosols, the models will drastically change. So there's a lot of things that you can do which might explain this very nice fit to past data. So the only data here is in blue. And of course, we don't have any future data. But the mean diverges from every, we get this kind of star-shaped fan out where the multi-model mean is going to diverge from every scenario that the models model, and so we might not want to only use the multi-model mean, which had been the standard practice. So a whole line of our work had been, how do we use past observations and future model predictions to get more robust predictions of future climates. So I'm going to actually not spend a huge amount of time on this because I don't have that much more time, but this has been one of our contributions. Most of the things that we did involved online learning. We did also some other approaches using Markov random fields and sparse matrix completion. Okay, so here are some of the cool things in terms of, this is a machine learning audience. Why is this interesting in terms of machine learning? Is that this line of work helped us to pursue learning not only with temporal non-stationarity, but when the concept that we're trying, the target concept can change not only over time, but also other dimensions, such as latitude and longitude. But we also showed that it could be done in finance, where the dimensions are just markets in different countries. And we showed that we can design online learning algorithms and distributed online learning algorithms that learn the level of non-stationarity both over time and these other dimensions, of course, in this application space. We also showed algorithms that would exploit local structure in both space and time. And so I think because I want to leave time for discussion and maybe mentioning other colleagues in the field of climate informatics and some cool findings over there, I'm going to actually just skip through this whole thing. However, I do want to show you the middle bullet because that, I think we're safe to claim that it was an open problem in machine learning. It was kind of interesting. So, go really quickly. Okay. So, we have an ensemble of models. We have the model from Max Planck in Germany. We have a French model. I didn't do my homework about what models we have in Latin America. Sorry about that. NASA model, NCAR in Boulder. And each model in this scenario has to predict. So in January, I have to predict for example, temperature in February, but I simultaneously in January have to have a March prediction, an April prediction, all the way out to the end of the year. So I output 12 different time frames of prediction. This can be applicable elsewhere. We did this for predicting the volatility of the Dow portfolio of stocks. So a lot of these things transfer nicely to finance. So of course, whenever you receive a true observation, a feedback, that's the only time you can apply prediction loss to update your classifiers or your distribution over experts. And so the idea is that you should share information between the different tasks. So we treated the different forecast periods as different tasks and used multitask learning. And the first approach, sort of a proof of concept, is quite simple. It's just saying, let's assume some temporal structure. So if the German model in January does a good job of predicting May, we'll assume that it's probably doing a pretty good job of predicting April and June. So we just assumed some neighborhood structure. Ideally, you might want to learn such a dependence from the data. We have a spatial version where we do that. This is looking for temporal neighborhoods. And then there's a knob S on how much weight you want to share with your neighbors. So you can think of just changing standard hedge to look at your temporal neighbors when you're reasoning about how much weight you should give a model for a particular time lag. And so looking at improvements, so reductions in prediction loss versus standard hedge, all the time frames showed improvements. And you have this knob S, how much you include. And there were only 2 time frames where you got diminishing returns after a certain S. Some of these make sense. So for example, if I'm predicting at a 2-week lag, I don't necessarily want stale data from 2 months ago. But it was interesting to see that all these tasks performed better than being done independently. And it works in finance. This is my sign that I should probably wrap up. OK, so I gave some vignettes from my lab. And I think I'll skip the vignettes from the literature, although it can be asked about those. And conclude by saying this is a compelling application area for machine learning. And you can still get some very interesting algorithms out of it and work at a sweet spot. I tried to show you that there's open problems in how do you do object tracking when it's a highly deformable, ephemeral object. How do you predict at multiple timescales simultaneously? We did that vignette. And more broadly, we are working on online learning plus spatial, where this was open even in the theory. So hopefully we can all work on this and address climate change to preserve our natural resources and communities for years to come. And come visit in Boulder. That's where I live. Resources.
Are there questions from the floor?
Hi, amazing job. What about air quality and climate change?
Yeah, so I'm interested in that. I haven't worked on it yet. Google actually did a very small study where they put different air quality sensors on the cars that measure for street view. And they drove a lot around a city, although then I was worried, well, you made the air quality worse. So yeah, I'm sure there's things that can be done there. It's not something I have done yet. I've been pulled into some like AI for air quality cohorts, but I haven't started contributing yet. And if that's an area that you work on or have collaborators, I would love to chat offline.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any? Yep. There's a question at the back.
Hello. Here. So thanks for your talk. It's very inspiring, and thanks for pointing out like the low-hanging fruit. I think there's a lot of it in this field, but yeah, you pointing it out is really helpful. My question is non-technical. I just wanted to ask you, how were you guys affected by climate change denial in your funding and in your research in general? And what's your thoughts on that and how to address that? Thanks.
I am not affected by climate change denial in my family, I am happy to say. But it is actually an interesting question. So Danielle kind of alluded to that I was doing this back when it wasn't cool. And so I really try to, I think it's important to separate any like belief or bias or politics from this work, because I think a more compelling argument for this work, and actually why I think climate scientists welcome this work, is that everybody knows machine learning works. We have Google reading our thoughts and suggesting things in our email. Everybody knows that this technology works, and can we do a dispassionate, data-driven analysis of the data? And this is known to be a good export from the informatics community. It revolutionized biology. Can we use it to shed light on climate change? But it's true. I used to just say climate science. Also, it's a very cheap way to unlock insights in the data that we already have. Climate models are extremely complex and expensive, and they're being run, and you have simulations under so many different scenarios. The data is saved. How do you interpret it? So, yeah, but in general, I've steered clear of, politics. I'm a computer scientist, but.
Okay, we have a couple of questions from the viewers online. So one question is, how does the hurricane tracking system compare with the Kalman filter?
We haven't compared it.
Okay, all right. So are there any other questions? Yeah.
That said, though, the Kalman filter is typically used for data assimilation, where you have model data and observation data, and ours is just using observation data. Now, the geospatial fields are called reanalysis data, where observation data is passed through some sort of data assimilation technique or modeling technique, primarily for smoothing, but that's viewed as an observation product. When you get an observation product, it's usually a reanalysis product. But our technique is not doing data assimilation in that project. In the online learning project, essentially, not using a Kalman filter, this is a form of data assimilation, because you have predictions, and then at the end of the prediction epoch, you have observations. That gives you your prediction losses. It's supervised online learning. And that's how you make your updates.
Okay, one more question.
Hi. Thank you for the presentation. I was thinking, how can I organize a kind of hackathon around this topic? I mean, where can I get the data? Where I can get the mentors? Because it's like, I am going to see the data, I don't understand anything about that. I need mentors that it's going to explain me.
Cool. Well, ramp.studio has 4 of our hackathons online. So those can be used for teaching purposes or for running a local hackathon. But also talk to us, and maybe we could do a Latin American event or hackathon, or yeah, that'd be awesome.
Okay, let's thank Claire one more time for that excellent talk.